Professor Gardner, welcome, and first of all, thank you so much for spending your valuable time on this interview that has been created for the occasion of the 6th edition of the States General of Digital School, taking place in Bergamo, in Italy, at the end of November 2021. In the light of your latest opera published in 2020, A Synthesizing Mind, which I read as the creative synthesis of a lifetime devoted to creative synthesis, in this interview I propose we navigate towards the inspirational horizon and perspective of that work, starting out from the specific harbor of educating to scientific thinking in the digital era. In this harbor, we are particularly interested in certain selected observations on the educational system from kindergarten to college and on how communities, at least in Italy, are smart or not. The observations are listed below and are followed by questions asked in the light of your work in A Synthesizing Mind. Let us begin with the first observation. We see over the course of centuries, on a long and large scale, that culture has been artificially split into humanistic and scientific. At the same time, the education in kindergartens, which is centered on a person's intelligences and therefore on his or her uniqueness, progressively gives way in higher grades and up to college to instruction that is instead centered on and split into disciplines. Often, we end up preparing citizens with highly specialized technical skills based on an evanescent culture. Now, in A Synthesizing Mind, you explain that multiple intelligences are like a chart which the synthesizing mind can use as sources in an a priori and unpredictable manner, as in the case of our Gardner, who took his sources from music and nature rather than linguistic, logic, and interpersonal intelligence, creating synthesis of existing or new ideas in any of the many different possible forms, for example, a small or large-scale synthesis. With an eye to the good project, one could also add in ethical and respectful ways. So now the question is, how can this inspirational viewpoint concretely change the conversation using your very effective expression on the above point?
Yes, I have sought in my own work to respect the disciplines, but to strive to make connections, rather than to create barriers or walls between them. Anyone who enters into public conversation hopes to change the conversation, but of course it usually does not work. At its best, a perspective changes the way that the conversation proceeds in the future, and in a desired direction, but of course sometimes what one says is misinterpreted, and more often than not, it is ignored. As a scholar and writer, I try to put forth my ideas as clearly as possible and in many different forms and formats as I can. I don't, however, spend much time on social media. I think of myself as writing for more serious readers and for the long run, rather than for the next few seconds or minutes.
I have another question about disciplines. In drawing the development model of a synthesizing mind from your own life, you list a number of traits, among which you cite, the following is lifted from A Synthesizing Mind, putting together preliminary answers in a non-disciplinary and undisciplined manner, seeing how they work or do not work, and setting answers down in some kind of symbolic system. So here's the question. Could we say that disciplines correspond to setting answers down in some kind of symbolic system? Would this definition of a discipline be the opposite of ever-rigid compartments, so that every researcher could actually build up his or her own discipline, in fact the way you did?
All human communication involves some kind of a symbolic system. The difference lies in whether one feels bound by the existing symbol systems and disciplines, or whether one seeks the best expression of one's thoughts, whether or not they are or even can be expressed in the usual ways. Nothing begins as a discipline, it starts as thoughts. The most effective means of expression eventually become disciplines, like physics or political science or the calculus. I would not say that I build up my own discipline. My work can be adequately described as a qualitative social science in the spirit of my own teachers, who are described in detail in a synthesizing mind. But you are right that my work is often critiqued or ignored by strict disciplinarians who want always to go by the book and who pounce on anyone who wants to test the boundaries. Accordingly, my writings are most likely to be appreciated by readers who have a broader perspective and are not keeping score.
Let us come to the second observation. Pedagogical competencies and disciplinary or non-pedagogical competencies suffer from not easily getting along together. For example, educators in K6 often feel uncomfortable in conceiving and doing scientific-like educational activities, and I wonder why this is not also true for arts-like activities. While, on the other hand, the university professors can easily fail in making students' talents emerge, especially when, for whatever reason, these talents are not expressed in conventional manners. So, while contemporary focus is being devoted to rethinking the process of education, professional development, school and academic recruitment, and corresponding systems for teachers' assessment of competencies, we seem to have a long road ahead of us. Now, your personal story stands as an example of how many conventional disciplines can be unconventionally crossed. Let us call them undisciplines, in a whole lifetime. Even physics pops up at one point, though only as a possibility. And so here come the questions. How could the ideas developed in a synthesizing mind be implemented in order to synthesize pedagogical and non-pedagogical competencies? And second, could your ideas support education to scientific thinking and any other kind of thinking from the age of 0-6, and how this can happen? And finally, I would like to ask the same question for pedagogical thinking in college contexts, for example.
In my memoir, I have told my own story as best as I can and have tried to draw lessons from it. But autobiographers are not necessarily the best qualified to describe their subjects. We are not neutral. And in any case, one's personal biography should never be taken as a receipt for other persons. Very briefly, the educational approaches that I favor take advantage of children's natural curiosity and help children to make sense of the world in various ways. That's what I love about the Reggio Emilia approach and the 100 languages of children. I am not opposed to disciplinary learning. Indeed, I am an enthusiastic advocate. Any person will be a fool to try to create physics or psychology or political science from the start. But if we want to have scholars or professionals who are innovative, creative, and innovation is not something that we can afford to marginalize, then they cannot and should not be slaves of any single discipline or methodology. In that sense, we need to keep alive the spirit of Reggio Emilia, and such early educational progressive milieux have disproportionate large effect on the creative ambitions and achievements of their graduates.
Let us proceed with the third observation. Science is often story-told for its rigorous and, for many people, abstruse formal toolbox, or else for its celebrated discoveries. It rarely is a story told for the creative synthesis that takes place every day, and which, besides being creative, often shapes the paths that lead to famous discoveries. As a result, scientific careers are not as popular even when science becomes popular, which does not happen at all times if we consider the latest anti-science movements. Now, art and science share experimentation, creativity and expression in some formal or symbolic language. In A Synthesizing Mind, you express the idea that arts competence is not the same as academic schoolwork, that IQ is different from AQ, and that the arts are a privileged home for creativity with their different symbolic language. Thus, here is the question: could you further elaborate on these statements and on the differences between art and science?
Most scholars and observers like to emphasize the similarities between the arts and the sciences, and that is fine. But the goals of the two enterprises are different. Science seeks an accurate and well-supported description of the world. The arts seeks to capture and convey various aspects of experience, and they have no obligation other than to capture the interest and the attention of those who participate in them. Of course, there are some individuals who excel in both science and art. Leonardo is everyone's favorite example. But most artists, great or not, would not know their way around a scientific lab. And most scientists, even if they like to play the violin or to draw caricatures.
Again, on creativity, you say the creative mind solves problems and introduces novel, if not unprecedented, ideas, but that these must be recognized by others, and that in any case they need a disciplinary mastery and some prior synthesis. Does this mean synthesis is one of the routes, or perhaps the privileged route to creativity?
Good question. Synthesis covers a very wide terrain. A textbook is a synthesis, but so is Darwin's masterwork, The Origin of Species. Some syntheses are ambitious and fail. Others may be modest but are successful. I am personally attracted to the works of synthesizers who create works of wide interest. For example, in our time, the biologist Jared Diamond, the commentator Yuval Harari, the political theorist Hannah Arendt and Daniel Allen. But there are excellent synthesizers who have no pretense to be creative. And there are individuals who are highly creative but don't have the inclination or the capacity to synthesize, or who can only do it orally but not in writing.
Here we are to the fourth observation. Girls and boys, women and men, undertake scientific or pedagogical studies and then enter corresponding careers in very different quantities and at very different rates. The quantity and the rates also depend on the career stage. For both genders, this would appear to be a large form of unused intelligences, both quantitatively and qualitatively. A number of society-driven factors certainly favor this outcome in a vicious cycle, including stereotypes, the way formal learning and research environments are organized and what they value most, especially in the academy, and also role models. Now, one of the beauties I see in multiple intelligences, in 5 minds for the future and the synthesizing mind, is how uniqueness emerges from differences and diversities. In a synthesizing mind, you occasionally touch on the topic of gender differences and introduce the female figures that have been important for you. This question is for both Howard Gardner, the writer of memoirs, and for Howard Gardner of the synthesizing mind. Do you think there might be gender differences in the way the multiple intelligences and or the synthesizing mind work?
We don't know the answer to this question, and even if we did, we would not know the reason for it. For example, decades ago, there were no women biologists on the faculties of major universities. Now, no university of quality would have an all-male faculty. The brains, minds have not changed. It's the goals, the opportunities, and the hiring system. Similarly, as a youth, I collected all sorts of useless information and carried it around with me like snowflakes or grains of sand. That included baseball scores, stock prices, television ratings, political votes. That inclination was much more common in males than in females. But perhaps the girls in my age cohort were collecting information about different topics: art, clothing, style, food, novels, boys, etc. The synthesizer finds the way to put apparently useless information together. I have no doubt that women can do so as well as men. And perhaps both our politics and our journalism would be better if more women with synthesizing inclinations were placed in key positions in these sectors.
In a synthesizing mind, you heartily write about the importance of role models in your academic and somehow also personal life. like in the case of Jerry Brunner and Nelson Goodman, as well as in your life, like it has been for your Uncle Fritz. It is crystal clear how important these figures have been for you. So, how important do you think it could be for women to have other women as role models?
I think it is very important. We tend to be attracted to individuals with whom we sense some similarity, and as a mentor, and even now a grand mentor, there's no question that I resonate with individuals of whatever demography were like me in one way or another. Research many years ago showed that women in the US were more likely to go on to graduate study in the science if they attended an all-women's college. And also there were some male teachers who encouraged women scholars and did not prey on them. The same holds, by the way, for individuals who come from different racial and ethnic groups. If I had another life to live, I would strive to broaden the group to which I might serve as a role model. Fortunately, for that purpose, I worked for 54 years at a graduate school of education, and most of my students and colleagues have been women. I hope that despite the gender difference, I have been a decent role model for these young women.
We now proceed to the fifth observation. Inter, multi, and cross-disciplinary approaches to research are now considered a must if we wish to explore the epic questions of humankind. And even citizen science approaches are steadily entering research work. The question this time is quite straightforward. Could you outline the traits of an inter-cross-disciplinary researcher from the perspective of a synthesizing mind? And the second question, how could the training and recruitment system of researchers in academic institutions be designed to favor a diffused and massive presence of researchers with the ability to master this trait?
As I said earlier, we need to develop and nurture disciplinary skills, but not at the expense of approaching problems, challenges, tasks in ways that are most appropriate, even if they don't follow strict disciplinary rules, norms, and boundaries. Having interdisciplinary role models, giving assignments and rewards for work that cuts across the disciplines, and making such hires and promotions is crucial. Of course, we need role models who exemplify this trait. In my memoir, I describe a dozen persons who were outstanding interdisciplinary synthesizers, each of whom had great influence on me. Most important, we need to resist the temptation to make hires who are outstanding in only one discipline and to ignore those whose strengths are in interdisciplinary or synthesizing thinking. I was fortunate enough to slip through the system in the United States some decades ago, but I'm not pleased with the current trends. More and more specialization, even hyperspecialization. Perhaps AI, artificial intelligence, will shake up the whole hiring and promotional system. We'll see.
So, here we come to our sixth and last observation. Artificial intelligence is pervading our everyday life and characterizes research methods, especially in the hard sciences. In this advancing era of quantum computers, fundamental research questions are again returning at center stage, and in different ways than before. For example, questions such as whether a computer might one day replace the human mind, provided it is powerful enough. This whole topic corresponds to one of the questions explicitly left open at the end of a synthesizing mind. So, first question is, could you elaborate on it further? And second question, you have changed the word's conversation about the meaning of intelligence. What would you say about consciousness instead, and its relationship to intelligence, if any? And finally, what does the concept of mind and matter mean to you, if it does?
I think of each intelligence as a separate computer. Clearly, computing can take place whether or not you have a conscious entity. I think that consciousness is a biological process that exists in some animals. Obviously, it is more central for human beings than for horses, dogs, or even dolphins. Consciousness is a property of our mental capacities, our brain, everything that we perceive or feel. But I have not studied consciousness. Perhaps I'll do that in another life. Of course, my consciousness will be different then.